Game of Thrones has had to cut a lot from the books for a variety of reasons, and since the more fantasy elements have always been my favorite to read about, I thought I would make a list of instances where magic was cut from the show in no particular order. The events that took place at the House of the Undying in Season 2 are vastly different from what occurred in the second book, A Clash of Kings. Piet-Pri doesn't lure Daenerys to their home base by stealing her dragons. Instead, he convinces her that the leader of the warlocks will provide her with insight and guidance because of how long they have lived and how powerful they are. After some strange ordeals, she finally comes across the Undying Ones in a very strange room. They all were laying motionless on the ground and their skin has all turned blue. In front of her was a table with a floating blue heart that was still pulsing and emanating light. She's brave enough to sit down at the table when across from her at the end of the table, a seemingly dead woman sat without breathing. The Undying Ones are barely able to speak, but they reassure Dany that they, along with the woman, are still alive. Dany begins to see some visions while they climb on her and try to drain her life from her. Well, this is what Daenerys believes they were doing. Drogon snaps her out of the visions and breathes fire on all the Undying Ones to save her. Piet-Pri was killed in the show instead of the Undying Ones. This all took place in the Clash of Kings, chapter 48, Daenerys' 4th POV chapter. This is one of the strangest reads in all the books, and even if you're not into reading the books because of how slow they can be at times, I think it's worth checking out. It's one of those reads where you have to go back online over and over to try and figure out what's going on. For the majority of the story, Melisandre went around proclaiming Stannis Baratheon to be the promised prince who will save the world, also called Azor Ahai Reborn. Azor Ahai was this hero thousands of years ago who fought against some sort of darkness. He fought with a sword called Lightbringer that he created by driving the blade into his wife's heart. When he pulled it out, it became a magical flaming sword. In the books, Melisandre tries to recreate this story with Stannis. She has wooden figures of all the gods from the Faith of the Seven burned, and a sword thrust into one of the gods' heart called the Mother. From that moment on, his sword would glow with magical light, but Maester Aemon would later point out that his sword was nothing like Lightbringer. That weapon from Legends would leave monsters bursting in flames, and Stannis' blade gave off no heat. When Catelyn Stark is with Stannis and Renly, she notes that a great square-cut ruby was set in the hilt of the sword he wore. So it does seem like Melisandre has been using her glamoring magic to fool others into believing Stannis is in fact Azor Ahai Reborn to gain more supporters. Even Catelyn was fooled by the sword when she first set eyes on it. In that same chapter she says, "The steel gleamed strangely bright in the sunlight, now red, now yellow, now blazing white. The air around it seemed to shimmer, as if from heat." The show didn't bother adding in these special effects, however. The show also didn't bother with giving a three-eyed raven a backstory, but he's actually Brendan Rivers, the bastard son of a Targaryen. He was born 125 years ago and went missing 48 years ago. He had served as a Lord Commander of the Night's Watch for a while, and when he was 77 years old, he disappeared ranging north of the Wall. We know that he's been living out the rest of his life with the Children of the Forest. There were always rumors of him practicing magic, even when he lived in King's Landing. So with his green sight, he probably saw where he needed to be. He was already an old man when he left the Night's Watch, so maybe he knew that the children were the only ones who could preserve his life. This is how Bran describes him in A Dance with Dragons, chapter 34, his 3rd POV chapter. Seated on his throne of roots in the great cavern, half corpse, half tree, Lord Brendan seemed less a man than some ghastly statue made of twisted wood, old bone, and rotted wool. The only thing that looked alive in the pale ruin that was his face was his one red eye, burning like the last coal in a dead fire, surrounded by twisted roots and tatters of leathery white skin hanging off a yellowed skull. The sight of him still frightened Bran, the weirwood roots snaking in and out of his withered flesh, the mushrooms sprouting from his cheeks, the white wind worm that grew from the socket where her eye had been. He liked it better when the torches were put out. In the dark, he could pretend that it was a three-eyed crow who whispered to him and not some grisly, talking corpse. Game of Thrones settled for an elderly man with long hair and facial hair, but would change things up a little later with a clean-cut actor. He has very little strength left in him, and the weirwood just keeps him lingering on so he can fulfill whatever it is he has planned. But he isn't the only one in the cave in this state. When Bran works into Hodor in the same chapter, he adventures his new home. He found chambers full of bones, shafts that plunged deep into the earth, a place where the skeletons of gigantic bats hung upside down from the ceiling. He even crossed a slender stone bridge that arched over the abyss and discovered more passages and chambers on the far side. One was full of singers, enthroned like Brendan in nests of weirwood roots that wore under and through and around their bodies. Most of them looked dead to him, but as he crossed in front of them, their eyes would open up, follow the light of his torch, and one of them open and close a wrinkled mouth as if he were trying to speak. The Children of the Forest may be doing this to every one of their kind, as their sort of burying ritual. There are magical horns, 2 so far that are supposed to be able to do some game-changing feats. The first is a dragon horn, one currently belonging to Euron Greyjoy. It's called Dragonbinder and can supposedly allow the wielder to control dragons. Euron has given it to his younger brother to show Daenerys and convince her to marry him. The only time it was blown into was by one of Euron's men. The Valyrian glyphs on it glowed red, and the man died from his lungs burning. The second is the Horn of Winter, also called the Horn of Joramun. Joramun was the king beyond the wall, who is said to have blown into it and woke giants from the ground. The Horn of Winter is said to be able to destroy the wall just by blowing into it. Mance Rayder said he found it north of the wall in a grave and threatened to use it. Tormund Giantsbane later reveals to Jon that the horn he has was a fake and the real one was never really found. But there was an old war horn found with the dragon glass by the Night's Watch when they were at the Fist of the First Men beyond the wall. It would be kind of weird if someone bothered to bury just a regular old horn, so let's see if anything comes of this. Even in the Game of Thrones scene of the Fist of the First Men, a horn is amongst the dragon glass, but that went nowhere. One of the more classical fantasy tropes Game of Thrones didn't even bother with was the Black Gate. In the season 3 finale, Bran and his group run into Sam and Gilly in an abandoned Night's Watch castle. This abandoned castle is massive and used to be where the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch would live. It was the first one of the 19 Night's Watch castles built thousands of years ago, so it was the first to fall apart. Since it was too expensive to maintain, the large night fort went to ruin. There's a lot of crazy lore about this place, but that's a video on its own. Instead of Sam just showing Bran the way out of this place, in the books he leads him to this magical Black Gate. It's a hidden exit that leads beyond the wall. It's made of weirwood in the shape of a giant face that somehow glows. When you approach it, the weirwood face actually opens its eyes and asks who you are. The only way to open the gate is by reciting the Night's Watch's vows. If you do know the vows, the Black Gate will say, "Then pass," and its mouth opens wide enough for you to go through it. This is some pretty wild stuff, but I don't really mind cutting this out, because I don't see a reason to spend this much money creating a set and paying for all that CGI for one really small scene. One thing I wasn't so okay with was cutting out glass candles. I feel like I've been talking a lot about this topic in my videos lately, but if you don't know what they are, they're these magical candles made from obsidian or dragon glass that don't really do anything unless they are burning, and getting them to burn is pretty much impossible. It seems like glass candles do it on their own time when magic in the world is powerful enough. In the current book story, they have recently began burning again, and some of the magically inclined characters believe it has to do with dragons returning. When they are burning, sorcerers can use them to see anywhere in the world and speak with others like a phone. They could also give people dreams and visions. It seems like it was the Valyrians who were responsible for creating them, and with them gone, there may not be very many left in the world. Quaithe uses one in the books to speak with Daenerys after she leaves Qarth. The main reason I wanted glass candles in the story was because of Quaithe. I think this character needed some kind of resolution in the show, and I fear we won't be getting that in the final season. The second character who uses one is a book-only character named Marwyn the Mage. He's an archmaester of the Citadel, so he's the most educated maester on magic. In the only chapter he appears in the books, he speaks with Sam about what's going on beyond the wall, then gets up to leave for Daenerys. Shade of the Evening was something removed that honestly wouldn't need a whole lot of effort to implement into the show. It was briefly mentioned in Qarth, but Shade of the Evening is a thick blue liquid the warlocks drink that allows them to have visions.
Pyapri is one of the 30. It was customary for me to extend him an invitation. Customs die slow deaths in Qarth.
What is the House of the Undying?
It is where the warlocks go to squint at dusty books and drink Shade of the Evening. It turns their lips blue and their minds soft. So soft, they actually believe their parlor tricks are magic.
It's why their lips have turned blue, and why the Undying ones have entirely blue bodies. It tastes horrible at the initial sip, but soon begins to taste amazing. All those visions Daenerys was having at the House of the Undying was because she drank Shade of the Evening Pyapri gave her. Euron Greyjoy also gets his hands on some in the books, and his lips have already turned blue. But until we get a POV chapter from him, we won't know what he's seen. Because of how popular Jaqen H'ghar was in the show, the writers decided to bring him back as Arya's trainer in Braavos. As far as I can tell, he's a completely new character in the books, who doesn't give Arya a name. Her first encounter with him was pretty strange. His face is a skull with some skin still hanging off of it, and a worm coming out of his eye socket. Arya was wild enough to kiss the face and bite the worm, which makes his face turn to that of an old man. This seems like a huge step up from what we usually see from the Faceless Man. He seems like more of an illusion than just wearing a dead man's old face. Game of Thrones has really toned down the amount of wargs in the show. We've only really seen Bran and a couple of wildlings, But in the books, the three-eyed raven tells Bran that 1 man in every 1,000 is born a skin changer. All the Stark children are wargs, and we see Arya and Jon have wolf dreams. While Arya is blind in Bravos, she actually wargs into a cat. Jon still has ghosts with him, and his bond has grown to the point where he even realizes that he's a warg. There's this scumbag of a wildling named Varamir Sixskins, who's gathering animals to bond with, and became somewhat of a lord because of how powerful he became. He's dead now, but right before he died, he warged into one of his wolves, and now follows around Bran's direwolf, Summer. There's also this wildling skin changer staying with the Night's Watch, who has this giant boar. I don't really know if it's because of skin changers can sense one another, or because it's a boar, but ghosts can't be anywhere near it. The show has also toned down the more fantastical beasts. This one's also understandable, because dragons probably cost enough to create. A lot of the more magical beasts, like unicorns or krakens, haven't really been seen by a PvE chapter yet, but we have seen something called the Old Men of the River and a walking lizard. Old Men of the River are these huge horned turtles that live in the River Rhoyne in Essos. Tyrion comes across one when passing through this area, and the people on board with him view it as a god. Syrio Forel tells Arya that there are walking lizards kept in cages in Bravos, and I think he's a trustworthy character enough to believe this. Walking lizards honestly sound a lot like dinosaurs in their description, but think of any creature from a fantasy story and it's probably mentioned in these books, like griffins, centaurs, harpies, even giant apes like King Kong. One I expect to see in the upcoming books is giant ice spiders that once were under the control of the White Walkers. I know I must have missed a ton of some of the more fantasy elements cut from Game of Thrones, so if you can think of any, let's hear in the comments. My next video will be somewhat similar to this one, well if I could find some instances. That should be up in a few days, so I'll see you guys then. Thanks for watching.